He begins the article by writing, quote, "The world is on the edge of nuclear catastrophe in no small part because of the failure of Western political leaders to be forthright about the causes of the escalating global fight Russia." We begin today's show looking at U.S. policy on Russia and China. We're joined by the economist Jeffrey Sachs, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He served as advisor to 3 UN secretaries general. His latest article is headlined, "The West's False Narrative About Russia and China." He begins the article by writing, quote, "The world is on the edge of nuclear catastrophe in no small part because of the failure of Western political leaders to be forthright about the causes of the escalating global conflicts. The relentless Western narrative that the West is noble while Russia and China are evil is simple-minded and extraordinarily dangerous," Jeffrey Sachs writes. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to Democracy Now! Why don't you take it from there?
Good to be with you.
What is the story that people in the West and around the world should understand about what's happening right now with these conflicts with Russia and Ukraine, and with China?
The main point, Amy, is that we are not using diplomacy. We are using weaponry. This sale now announced to Taiwan that you've been discussing this morning is just another case in point. This does not make Taiwan safer. This does not make the world safer. It certainly doesn't make the United States safer. This goes back a long way. I think it's useful to start 30 years ago. The Soviet Union ended, and some American leaders got it into their head that there was now what they called the unipolar world, that the U.S. was the sole superpower and we could run the show. The results have been disastrous. We have had now 3 decades of militarization of American foreign policy. A new database that Tufts is maintaining has just shown that there have been more than 100 military interventions by the United States since 1991. It's really unbelievable. And I have seen in my own experience over the last 30 years, working extensively in Russia, in Central Europe, in China, and in other parts of the world, how the U.S. approach is a military first and often a military only approach. We arm who we want. We call for NATO enlargement no matter what other countries say may be harmful to their security interests. We brush aside anyone else's security interests. And when they complain, we ship more armaments to our allies in that region. We go to war when we want, where we want, whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq or the covert war against Assad in Syria, which is even today not properly understood by the American people, or the war in Libya. And we say, we're peace-loving. What's wrong with Russia and China? They are so warlike. They're out to undermine the world. And we end up in terrible confrontations. The war in Ukraine, just to finish the introductory view, could have been avoided and should have been avoided through diplomacy. What President Putin of Russia was saying for years was, do not expand NATO into the Black Sea, not to Ukraine, much less to Georgia, which if people look on the map, straight across to the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Russia said, this will surround us, this will jeopardize our security, let us have diplomacy. The United States rejected all diplomacy. I tried to contact the White House at the end of 2021. In fact, I did contact the White House and said, there will be war unless the U.S. enters diplomatic talks with President Putin over this question of NATO enlargement. I was told the U.S. will never do that. That is off the table. And it was off the table. Now we have a war that's extraordinarily dangerous, and we are taking exactly the same tactics in East Asia that led to the war in Ukraine. We're organizing alliances, building up weaponry, trash talking China, having Speaker Pelosi fly to Taiwan when the Chinese government said, please lower the temperature, lower the tensions. We say, no, we do what we want, and now send more arms. This is a recipe for yet another war. And to my mind, it's terrifying. We are at the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I've studied all my life, and I've written about. I've written a book about the aftermath. We are driving to the precipice, and we are filled with our enthusiasm as we do so, and it's just unaccountably dangerous and wrong-headed, the whole approach of U.S. foreign policy, and it's bipartisan.
Jeffrey Sachs, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that you mentioned in a recent article that was published in Consortium News was this insistence of the United States, dragging Europe along as well, in maintaining hegemony throughout the world at a time when the economic power of the West is declining. You mentioned, for instance, that the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represent more than 40% of the world's population and have a greater GDP than the G7 nations, yet their interests and their concerns are pretty much dismissed, or in the case, obviously, of Russia and China, portrayed to the American people as the aggressors, as the authoritarians, as the ones that are creating turmoil in the world. I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And directing us to that is extremely important. The disproportionate power of the Western world, and especially the Anglo-Saxon world, which started with the British Empire and now the United States, is about 250 years old, so a short period in world history. It happened for a lot of very interesting reasons that the Industrial Revolution came to England first. The steam engine was invented there. That's probably the single most important invention of modern history. Britain became militarily dominant in the 19th century, like the United States was in the second half of the 20th century. Britain ran the show. Britain had the empire on which the sun never set. And the West, meaning the United States and Western Europe, now meaning the US and the European Union, the UK, Canada, Japan, in other words, the G7, the European Union, together, is a small part of the world population, perhaps now roughly 10%, a little bit more, maybe 12.5% if you add in Japan, to Western Europe and the US. But the mindset is we run the world. And that was the way it was for 200 years in this industrial age. But times have changed. And really, since the 1950s, the rest of the world, when it gained independence from European imperialism, started to educate its populations, started to adopt and adapt and innovate technologies. And lo and behold, a small sliver of the world really didn't run the world or didn't have a monopoly on wisdom or knowledge or science or technology. And this is wonderful. The knowledge and possibility of decent lives is spreading throughout the whole world. But in the United States, there's a resentment to this, a deep resentment. I think there's also a tremendous historical ignorance because I think a lot of US leaders have no clue as to modern history, but they resent China's rise. That is an affront to the United States. How dare China rise. This is our world. This is our century. And so starting around 2014, I saw step by step, I watched it with intense detail because it's is an affront to the United States. How dare China rise? This is our world. This is our century. And so starting around 2014, States, there's a resentment to this, a deep resentment. I think there's also a tremendous historical ignorance because I think a lot of U.S. leaders have no clue as to modern history, but they resent China's rise. That is an affront to the United States. How dare China rise? This is our world. This is our century. And so starting around 2014, I saw step by step, I watched it with intense detail because it's my daily activity, how the United States recast China, not as a country that was recovering from a century and a half of great difficulty, but rather as an enemy. And we consciously, as a matter of American foreign policy, started to say we need to contain China. China's rise is no longer in our interest.